right. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Day 2 of Build, yay! We're here today with the FastTrack for Azure engineering team, and we're here to take your questions. So, yes, so I think really, for all of you who have been attending these sessions, you probably already know all of this, but the main thing that I wanted to just note is that what's highlighted in the orange box is upvote your favorite questions so that we can make sure that we prioritize them. All right, and the next slide. And again, just wanted to very quickly flash the Microsoft Code of Conduct. This session is being recorded. And with that, we've got our FastTrack expert engineers. And we'll start with Umar.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Umar Muhammad Usman. I am one of the FastTrack engineer. I primarily focus on a lot of app dev stuff like app services, AKS, DevOps, and Azure integration services like Logic Apps, APM, Service Bus, etc. And as you all know, Azure is so broad. There's no way one person knows everything. These sessions calling expert us, and it's kind of disservice. But we do have lots of other engineers along with me today as well. And unfortunately, only 2 people can talk. So that's me and Josh Ludeman. I'm going to let him introduce. Before that, we also have on our team, Dean Safola. He also has a superpower. He runs an Azure Academy, really a popular one on a YouTube channel. You can check it out. And also, he's our infra engineers and WVD, Windows Virtual Desktop, and he can answer all those things. Nick McCullum is our app dev, another app dev engineer, kind of specializes on a lot of our identity and security stuff, B2B and B2C kind of stuff, and API management as well. And Bradley Ball is one of our data engineer, definitely a great engineer in terms of Azure Synapse, SQL DB, Azure Arc for data. And so those are services he will focus on. So we have a set of folks here. Definitely will try to help you answer as many questions as possible. But with that, I'll hand it over to Josh to introduce himself.
Thanks, Umar. My name is Josh Ludeman, everyone. I'm also a senior engineer on the team with Umar and the rest of the crew. My focus is on analytics, machine learning, NoSQL, those sorts of things. So between Bradley and I, we'll be able to help you out across the board with your questions in the space.
All right. So with that, I'll quickly talk about very few lines of what is our team does, FastTrack for Azure. Our team primarily focuses on helping customer like you to onboard onto Azure. So the customer, anybody, doesn't have to be only very top customers. Any customer who wants to onboard onto Azure, deploys their solutions on Azure, we support. And of course, there are like hundreds and thousands of customers out there. We cannot support everybody. From that perspective, we do have some eligibility criteria. So the eligibility criteria is basically once you successfully onboard onto our platform on using any of those services that we support, pretty much we support almost lots of services. And the goal is you at least consume 5,000 a month once you successfully onboard onto a platform. It's not a day one. Once you successfully onboard onto our platform, you start consuming at least 5K a month. And with that, we will offer you our engineering resources like me and all the engineers you saw. And we will help you onboard onto that, starting from architectural guidance. We help you architect. We work with you alongside understanding your business requirement and helping you select right Azure services. And also, once you architect successfully following the best practices and stuff like that, we also help you implement that, deploy that services using best practices and stuff like that. So with that, keeping in mind what's coming in the roadmap, should you be selecting this service or that service, and why is there so many services out there? So we'll kind of help you side by side, work with you to provide you guidance to, not only architect as well as help you deploy successfully. So that's our goal. That's what our team does. All right. And I do have some canned questions, but we can go over that if you don't have enough questions to talk about it. But at this point of time, I'm going to stop the PowerPoint in here. We start taking some questions. And do you want to go ahead and start?
Yeah, there's a question. What should I take in consideration for deciding, choosing Azure Functions or App Service, Web Job, or Cloud Service?
Yeah, so that I can take that question for sure. Azure App Services is our in code app, like you're really deploying your where your web application. It could be a front end UI application, or you have a API type application. That's your web apps. You're going to deploy that, right? But then Azure App Services also have something called Web Job. Web Jobs allows you to do you run your background task. This is our typical NT jobs, which you are used to running it, right? That's where NT jobs you can run on a web jobs. But at the same time, you also compare with the functions. Functions, you can pick web jobs or functions. Either way, it doesn't matter. If you want to bring your on-prem code and run it as is, right, without a whole lot of change, your web job is a perfect solution for it. But if you're up for a change that, hey, I'm willing to make some code changes, I want to get into this functions programming model, and you can definitely run it. And at the same time, functions always has some sort of how long a function can execute. There are some restrictions in there. Functions is getting better and better day in and day out. Like function has a consumption plan, right? It's basically pay-as-you-go plan. We only pay you what you're really using it for, right? And you can use that, or you can use from a function. You can also use the functions on app service plan, where you have a dedicated resource already provisioned. You're running a function in it, and that's it makes it easier. We also introduced these days a premium plan. So with that, we keep increasing how long a function can execute. So the line is clearly blurring between the web job and a function. So you could either use a function or a web job. But again, if you're up for if you don't want make a code change from your on-prem code you're bringing in, use a web job. But if you are really building something net new greenfield application, use a web job. Right?
Great. Thank you. There's another question. What does the serverless option mean for Azure SQL Server?
All right, so I'm going to hand that question out to Josh. Well, I can try to answer, but he's our expert on the SQL side. Josh, you want to take it that one? We cannot hear you, Josh. Can you unmute yourself, please?
Of course I did this. We're in that day and age where someone was ultimately going to do that, and of course it's me. So with the serverless option, with Azure SQL Database, you're basically you're not holding on to, we'll say, like actual compute in time. Now, one of the things to go deeper into that, we actually have Bradley Ball in the chat room. He's actually going to go ahead and take on that one at a deeper level than what I can do it justice.
Thank you. Another question. Let's see here. What are the Autoscale options for Cosmos DB? And I think, let me rephrase it. When does it make sense for Autoscale options for Cosmos DB?
I personally, when talking to customers about using Autoscale for Cosmos, is when we're talking about very variable workloads, so that the service can actually adjust to your workload and scale, so that you're not having to monitor and really stay on top of it. Now, from the standpoint of auto scaling as well, it's a beware kind of feature. Because my concern is if you just deploy and start using Cosmos and turn on Autoscale, it can become a situation where Autoscale can, if you're not well tuned and adhering to best performance practices, obviously Autoscale will let it go ahead and scale right up. And you could be paying for more performance than maybe what you actually should be. Because you're basically masking with resources some underlying design issues. So I'd definitely be cautious with that. but especially when you're talking about workloads that very highly variable, almost like a roller coaster ride. Those workloads definitely are workloads I would look at for autoscale situations, as long as you've looked at and done a lot of testing around the performance of the application and are sure you're getting the best performance possible out of it.
Thank you. And Josh, there's an ask specifically if you could share the link to the document that you're currently sharing into the chat window.
Actually, that's Umar sharing his desktop. Umar, if you could post that right in there, that'd be great.
Yeah, Umar, that would be great. All right.
I did post it, Seema, already.
Oh, okay, wonderful.
So I was going to just tag it along and say, the question comes up always, hey, there are so many compute options Azure provides. How do I select between a virtual machine to app services to functions? The same question another gentleman asked, hey, should I use app services web job or function? Should I use AKS? So this is a good compute function, compute decision tree. And again, every customer is unique. We don't want to box it everybody with a decision tree. You can always start this as a starting point, and you will try and you will run into some limitations. Then you look for another service, but always start with this here. This is a good decision tree to get you started. And same thing with the load balancer as well. I'll go ahead and post this in chat window as well. Always comes up with this question. Hey, so many load balancer. You have Azure load balancer, application gateway. You have front door. Or there's like, how do I choose one versus the other? Right? This is another good decision tree that you wanted to take into consideration as you're architecting your solution. Same way with messaging as well. There's so many messaging solutions. Azure Service Bus, you have Storage Queue, Azure Service Bus Queue, Storage Queue. Then you have Service Bus Topic. You have Event Grid, Event Hub, and like what should I do from a messaging perspective? There's a really good decision tree here as well, and talks about comparing these options. With that, go ahead and Seema with the next question.
Okay.
Thank you. And I just want to add one thing on to what Umar was saying. Under the reference architectures as well, in the data side, one of the common questions, especially in data that we get a lot, is what data services should I be looking at? Managed instance or Azure SQL database or Azure Synapse? And when you go into the specific architecture patterns on the data side as well, it will actually talk about the services that are available at each level of the architecture, whether you're talking about, file storage. So in the case of, Azure Data Lake or a relational data store and using data warehouse, those decision trees are in there as well. Because I actually saw that as a question, that a very detailed question about which data services to use, whether it be analytics or data factory or Synapse and things like that. That documentation actually helps to focus that conversation a little bit more. But when you're talking about, specific services at a specific layer, some of it's an architectural decision. Some of it's actually a people decision, as well. And, and that can come into play. Do you have the experience with Python, or, is it a very SQL heavy shop? That can help you decide on which service to use in different tiers as well.
Right. Thank you, Josh. All right, another question. If you are a beginner, which direction will you take, Azure Function or Azure Web App? What are the primary differences and what are the pros and cons?
So if you're a beginner, let me understand the question. If you're a beginner, should I be selecting a web app or a function app? Is that correct?
Yes.
Which should I say? Okay. Yeah, so the answer is pretty straightforward. Web app is, like I said, web app is your full-fledged, your web UI type, you're running it. And as well as it could be, doesn't have to be web UI, you also run APIs in there. But if you're talking about, you have a small piece of code, then that's your functions choice. For instance, hey, a file lands in a storage account. I want to pick it up, that message, right? So the file, and I want to process, or I wanted to, on a schedule basis, I want to wake up every night. I wanted to do some cleanup in my database, or I want to delete a file. I want to do that. That's kind of jobs that goes into functions, right? So that's really a small piece of code. Want to run it? It will be a function. If you want to run a full-fledged web app, it'll be like your Azure App Services web apps. And you can always run, these days, you can also run APIs, the microservices, right? The popular microservices. You can run them on functions as well. So it's just, yeah, I hope that answered that. Yeah.
Okay, thank you, Umar. Another question, are there best practices transferring relational data to NoSQL data storage?
That is a very good question because it's, as far as best practices for going from relational to, in essence, non-relational databases, there really isn't a best practice. I think when you start looking at moving the data into that scenario, one of the things you need to consider is making sure that how you're storing that data, for instance, in Cosmos, that you're using a good structure for partitioning the data, because again, that is really the main crux of a lot of the performance issues that we see when customers are moving into Cosmos, is making sure that the data is partitioned properly so that you're getting a good query performance and not having to use maybe more resources than what you actually have to get the performance tier that you're looking for.
Great, thank you. What scenarios would you use Synapse, Spark, Data Factory, Lake Analytics, or Bricks? There are so many options. Is there good documentation explaining the difference and when one is preferred over the other?
So there is a good documentation, especially in the architecture center. When you look at like the modern data warehouse and technology choices at each layer of that architecture pattern and some of the other data ones, that will actually tell you, these are the options at this tier. For, a data transformation tier, here's really, the 3 or 4 choices in play. So in this case, Data Lake Analytics, Databricks, Data Factory, or Azure Synapse. There's obviously better choices for different technology scenarios. For instance, if you're looking at transforming data while it's streaming in to, say, a data lake, and you want to transform it on the fly, the ability of Databricks to do, take and transform streaming data using Databricks Delta, that's a huge win. Data Factory is a really good win for customers that are, looking at maybe static data, but the ability to use the features like mapping data flows to be able to give you a point-and-click environment for transforming that data is definitely a good way to bridge customers to Azure that maybe are used to that on-premises, using SQL Server integration services for transforming their data. Data Factory and mapping data flows are definitely a good win for you there. Synapse, really it comes into play with a deeper kind of view of what is actually going on with the data that you're going to be manipulating. And that's really where the decision comes into play. The last little piece of that decision that I think is actually very important and sometimes can get undervalued in this conversation is what kind of skill set does your team have in place already? I use the example when talking with customers that I'm not going to walk into an IT group that has been predominantly, using Microsoft technologies forever. They really don't have, say, a big Python or Scala skill set and say, we need to convert all of your transformations over to Databricks on a whim. You have to take into that people aspect into the decision, and it's actually very important. But one thing to keep in mind as well is it's not all one or the other. And that's one of the advantages that, that Azure and other, that building in the cloud can bring to you, is that now instead of looking at, we're a BI development department and we're a Microsoft shop, so we're an SSIS. Now we can say, well, we're in the cloud now, so we're going to use Azure's tools. So, this streaming data that we have coming in from maybe web logs or IoT devices, we're going to transform that data with Stream Analytics or with Databricks. But this data here, over here, our financial data is very stagnant, very static. We're going to use Data Factory to bring that over. but we have this huge bulk of maybe sports statistics data that we need to bring in every day. So we're going to use Azure Synapse to ingest that into our Synapse Analytics database. So again, there's a lot of different choices, but the true advantage is being able to mix and match for the specific use case that you're trying to tackle.
Thank you, Josh. Another question, is there a best practice or advice using the graphic API in multiple Azure applications, bot framework, function, web app, that are part of an overall product? An overall product is in quotes.
I'm gonna see if we can answer with Nick on that offline, that question on a chat window. So can we go to the next question, Seema?
Absolutely. All right. What do I have to consider to encrypt data in the different data storages? Can I use something from Azure?
Yeah, so I'm going to take it, but then hand it over to Josh as well. So from a data encryption perspective, the SQL DB, Cosmos DB, all of them, data at rest encrypts by default these days. We call it transparent data encryption, right? So the data gets encrypted. But now these days, we also announced, I think in this build, for Cosmos DB, you can bring your own encryption keys as well. Customer bring in own encryption key, BYOK, bring your own keys. That SQL supports it, Cosmos DB supports it. You can bring in your own encryption key to encrypt those data sitting in on disk as well. Josh, anything else to add?
So, and Umar, I think you hit it right on the head. Is that, you know, definitely there's features in Azure SQL Database today with TDE. Also, any data stored within an Azure data center is encrypted as well on the disk, you know, itself. I think when you're looking at SQL Server, you hit the nail perfectly. I think when we talk about encrypting data in other places as well, so talking about data lakes and things like that, traditionally we don't have a service necessarily today to encrypt the data so that when a user tries to access the data, who has access through traditional, like a data factory pipeline, the encrypting of that data stored in a data lake has to be done yourself using your own keys and some kind of encryption library and things like that. However, the data as it's stored on the disk itself is encrypted. So to say, is there an Azure service in that situation? No, there's not. But we've talked with other customers and worked with other customers themselves or ourselves to help them roll their own basically encryption at rest within data lake and things like that. So I hope that answers the question. If it doesn't, go ahead and resubmit the question again with a little bit more detail. We may not get to it today, but actually Brad and I will be are on the data architecture blog on Tech Community. I'll go ahead and post that as a link here, or Brad can in the Q&A. And we'll be following up with the data questions after the session in a blog post on that blog.
Okay, so there's one more question. Service map, PaaS services, for example, we have Event Grid, which fire logic app, which triggers functions and blog storage. Can I view all this flow in Service Map?
So I was going to say, if you were to instrument that with the logic app and starts with Event Grid firing a logic app, which is going to fire a function. If you instrument an application insight, and you should be able to track that from end to end in a service map. I don't think any reason you shouldn't be able to. Yeah, you should be able to. Yeah. I'm pretty sure that application insight works with the, logic apps, the application insight doesn't work in there. So I don't think we have an integration with the logic app. Like, it's not a turnkey integration. Application insight with the logic app, that might break it, but Event Grid and with functions, we'll have to check in there. Functions for sure, we have an application insight integration in there. Event Grid and logic app, I probably have to think through that and see if that is something there. But obviously that you can always, with the application insights, there is an API you can custom invoke to continue to send using that same application key the application insight key, that if you use the same key across all three all three components, they can all correlate with each other. You should be able to see that. But yeah, so Logic App does not have an application insight. From there, it might be a challenge. But again, it's not going to prevent you from doing a custom call. Yeah. Go ahead, Seema.
All right. Well, I think this will be our last question. Is there a scenario similar to SQL Server 2019 using Python as ML in Azure SQL Server?
At this time, that feature is not in Azure SQL Database. This, for feature availability questions like that, I would actually check out the Ask the Experts session, because I know the SQL Database team at some point during build is doing one. I would double check with them on that, because I'm not sure where that is in the timelines for getting that to the product, because again, I know it is in the box product.
I think we have time for one more question. Logic App, how can I see cost for particular Logic App that might be run in history? DF has this feature. Yeah, so anyway, hopefully that question makes sense. Otherwise, we can also take this offline since we are running short on time.
So we're trying to understand. So understand the question. So Logic App, you're trying to see the cost for that particular Logic App, how much it consumed. Is that the answer? Is that the question? So, I mean, let's take that question. I think that the answer is basically, if you wanted in your month end, you're going to get a bill, right? That's going to have all the services listed out. Okay, this is what you have consumed. If you really want to particularly say, hey, particular service, how much it costs, you can always tag those resources, right? And you can start with, once you have the tags and on a particular resource, and see how much a particular Logic App had cost. You could do that, or put it in a separate resource group, that Logic App, and there are multiple ways to spin that, and you can, like I said, you can use tags, or you can use in a separate resource group, and there are different ways to find the cost of that particular Logic App execution.
Wonderful. Well, we're almost at the end. Umar, I'm wondering if you want to just quickly.
The reason I brought up this slide was basically, yeah, so we were like, I don't know if we answered all the questions. What we had put in here was, if you have not answered the question, didn't satisfyingly answer, unfortunately, we cannot give out our email address, but you can always tweet us at my Twitter handle, or you can look me up on my LinkedIn, and same thing, you can do it, look up Nick on a LinkedIn as well. And you can post this question, and Brad and Josh has their blog, and we will take these questions from what's been asked, and we will try to blog some of those answers. If the answers we couldn't give it to you in the chat or over the mic, and we will try to blog on this data architecture blog, if you guys wanted to follow that, your questions which hasn't been answered in here. So that was that.
And in the Q&A chat, I went ahead and put Brad's Twitter handle, my Twitter handle, and the link to the data architecture blog, where we'll follow up with content and questions.
Awesome, wonderful. And Umar, if you wouldn't mind just going to the last slide, just to sort of end this. Thank you everyone for joining. I wanted to make sure all of the engineers that have been talking and chatting with you today are part of the FastTrack for Azure engineering team. We are part of Azure engineering. You'll see the URL here, as well as it's in the chat as well. And so certainly take a look at the program and all the expertise that our team can then bring to you and to your customers or to your company. I think with that, we will end the call.
Yeah, thank you so much, all. As Seema mentioned, you can go out and self-nominate yourself for the program. We'll be happy to chat with you and help you onboard onto Azure. Thanks all, guys.
Yep. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.